Hello, my name is Rita Zhang and I am a graduate from the University of Melbourne. I wrote my honours thesis last year on video game representations of the ancient world, focusing specifically on Ubisoft's 2018 release, Assassin's Creed Odyssey. Today I will be presenting a closer analysis of one section of my thesis, that is, a critical examination of graphics and gameplay in video game reconstructions of antiquity, looking at how these furnish depictions of the past with a greater sense of authenticity. I'll begin with a brief outline of the game itself for context, and then a background on historical verisimilitude and its relationship to realism and accuracy. I'll then engage critically with two primary aspects of the game which enforce this notion of accuracy: graphics, which evoke immersion and atmosphere, and gameplay, where I argue that the nature of Assassin's Creed Odyssey as a roleplay and open-world game fosters a false sense of autonomy and authority. The game's graphics and gameplay therefore inadvertently restrain the audience from taking a critical perspective of the game's depictions of ancient Greece. And, as I'll summarize in my conclusion, the ease with which players accept the game's representations demonstrates the importance of critical engagement with popular media reconstructions of antiquity. Assassin's Creed Odyssey is a single-player action-adventure game set in Greece in the 5th century BCE during the Peloponnesian War. The game also contains some elements of roleplay, meaning that, as a player, you have some freedom in the dialogue and actions you can take, which alter how your journey unfolds. You play a mercenary by the name of Alexios or Cassandra, and through quests you attempt to defeat a sinister cult, reunite your family, and bring an end to the war. This game is the franchise's second installment set in the ancient past, the first being Assassin's Creed Origins, which was set in Ptolemaic Egypt. Both games have been exceptionally popular amongst players with an interest in the game's historical settings, as well as those more captivated by the gameplay, emotional narrative, and impressive graphics. The commercial success of Assassin's Creed Odyssey and its reputation as the franchise's largest and most in-depth signifies an increasing shift towards video games as a mode of engagement with the ancient past. But why are video game representations of antiquity so compelling? And how does engagement differ from other virtual reconstructions? The answer seems to be a balance that's struck between realism and fiction. Verisimilitude denotes a semblance, or air of truth. In the context of historiography, verisimilitude refers to the appearance of historical facticity. In contrast to historical accuracy, verisimilitude relies on consensus, that is, the mainstream perception of a time or place, which is perpetuated through collective belief. Historical accuracy, on the other hand, implies the existence of a singular, absolute, and objective truth. In a medium as proliferate, speculative, and subjective as a video game, accuracy has a very contentious existence. What we know from Eurykio's seminal work on the intersection of video games and post-structural historiography is that the richer the specific historical detail, the more profound and pleasurable the play with the speculative. Historical verisimilitude is therefore crucial to the construction of an immersive virtual historical experience. And whilst getting the atmosphere right is very important, the game has also been praised by experts for its close attention to historical detail. As Assassin's Creed Odyssey's creative director Jonathan Dumont states, extensive research and consultation with a specialist in ancient Greek myth and language was taken to ensure that the game was as historically accurate as possible. The marketing around the game must also be taken into consideration. The game has been publicized as a historically accurate resource, and there is even a discovery mode that has been used in classrooms as an educational tool. So now we turn to the question of graphics. What do they do for a video game set in antiquity? How do they immerse and convince players of the authenticity or realism of their environment? Graphics play a very important role in the mediation of historical realism and fiction, as they must appear credible enough to convince players that their environment is historically authentic, whilst also remaining malleable enough and focused on individual subjective experience, so that the player can feel fully immersed in the game. The rendering of ancient Greece in such a visually arresting, almost physically engaging and accessible way is unprecedented, and much of it has to do with its high visual fidelity, or photorealistic graphics. Photorealism is the ability of a graphic to mimic real life as closely as possible, and it has been a very successful device at conveying both historical authenticity as well as a sense of lifelikeness. Both of these contribute to the experience of immersion, which is, as McMahon describes it, the feeling of being there. Another criterion for a game to be considered realistic, according to Galloway, is in the minutiae of everyday life. This entails a critical reflection on the most mundane sensory experiences, such as a difference in the sound of footsteps when your character walks over grass or rock, or the distinct sound of your sword clashing against armor or animal hide. Visual cues, like a dip in perspective as you rock over waves on a boat, or the generation of crowd stations that reflect real-life human traffic, help to reproduce the atmosphere of sea travel or a bustling marketplace. This level of detail indicates the labor invested in creating an immersive reconstruction of ancient Greece. The issue now is that because the graphics are so convincing, players are more likely to be uncritical and accept certain representations of the ancient past based on what they see in the game and how these correspond to the broader consensus of the popular imagination. Likewise, gameplay is another aspect that functions to immerse the player in the game world, and reinforces this same blurred boundary between fact and fiction through the implication of historical verisimilitude. Roleplay allows the audience a degree of autonomy in choosing their characters' actions and dialogue, instead of following a predetermined linear narrative. Notably, in Assassin's Creed Odyssey, many of these alternative dialogue or action options are superficial, with no material effect on the narrative. However, a few decisions made at key junctures in the game yield consequences that span the course of the storyline and cannot be reversed. In a similar way, an open-world game means that the player has the ability to explore the game environment as an unbounded territory. Like roleplay, it also enables the player to interact with objects more freely, with fewer restrictions placed on actions or items than in closed-world games, which usually focus on a main story or questline. Open-world roleplay games, like Assassin's Creed Odyssey, mean that the experience of play entails a physical, cognitive process that goes beyond the act of reading or watching a film. Virtual embodiment engages a player's perceptual and motor skills in a way that feels more direct and unmediated. However, the effect of this is that the choices delimited by the authority of the developer are easily mistaken as genuine autonomy. This compromises a player's self-awareness as a subject of the game, whose conceptions of the past are shaped by what the game developers have chosen to leave in or out of their reconstructions. These affordances of choice and the player's perceived authorship of the storyline and interaction with their environment is an illusion that partly obscures the authority of the developer. When considering graphical realism and this deeply embodied sense of immersion that induces a false agency, we must also take into account the existing power between player and developer that presupposes an inherent trust in what we are given to play with. As a result, this sense of autonomy in gameplay and deferral to graphics because of their visual fidelity heightens a player's tendency to be uncritical of the game's performative historical verisimilitude. With this presentation, I've shown how video games harness graphics and gameplay to immerse players into their world. I've also raised the concern that perhaps they are so effective and authoritative that players don't question what they're seeing or experiencing. I've introduced the notion of historical verisimilitude, that semblance of truth that video games are very easily able to tap into as a result of high visual fidelity graphics. I've also talked about the sense of autonomy and authorship granted by open-world roleplay games, which can obscure who is really in control of the experience. In this way, players are susceptible to accepting certain depictions of the past, which may have been exaggerated or romanticized or suppressed for the sake of the game's fantastical world. I don't think game developers are intentionally or explicitly misleading their audience into some historical falsehoods, but I do believe that the incidence of elements considered necessary for commercial success, such as immersion and illusion, suppresses a player's impulse to engage critically with the content of a game. As developers are increasingly successful at capturing the popular imagination with immersive, authentic depictions of the ancient world, the necessity of gaming with a critical eye has become ever more apparent.